Tokmachka is a tiny village in Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia region. It's only 3 square miles, or 8 square kilometers in size, and before the war began, it was home to around 3,000 people. It's one of countless other small Ukrainian settlements that have come under attack by the Kremlin's war machine. Yet, unlike so many others, Tokmachka has not been taken, despite the Russians throwing everything they have at this place for over 4 years. This tiny town that almost no one in the world has ever heard of has become the site of one of the longest-running sieges in history. It's also turned into Russia's most embarrassing frontline dead end. How did this happen? To understand that, we have to look at the full story of Tokmachka and find out what has made it such a tricky place for the Kremlin's forces to conquer. Situated in the Polehi district in central Zaporizhzhia, this place is no stranger to warfare and tragedy. It was founded in the late 18th century, during the days of the Russian Empire, by a mixture of settlers who came from Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Poltava regions in search of a fresh start and a better life. In the centuries that followed, the village witnessed the horrors of World War I and the bloody battles of the Ukrainian War of Independence, changing hands several times in the process. Tokmachka also survived the Holodomor, otherwise known as the Ukrainian famine, one of the most tragic events in Ukraine's history, in which an estimated 3.5 to 5 million Ukrainians died. 281 of them were from this village. During World War II, the area came under the occupation of Nazi Germany, before eventually being liberated by the Red Army, leading to the construction of a monument to honor the soldiers who saved the village. None of that, however, could have prepared Tokmachka for what came next. Even through all of those challenges, this tiny town managed to survive and even thrive to a certain extent. As far as Ukrainian villages go, it was a reasonably prosperous one, with its own local industry, infrastructure, and one of the region's larger penitentiaries, which helped to create jobs and opportunities for the villagers. But when 2022 came along and Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, Tokmachka soon suffered the same grim fate as many other Ukrainian settlements across the country's eastern regions. It was seized by the Russians in the initial assault, and while Ukrainian troops managed to force the Russians out just a few months later, the village's ordeal was far from over. In June 2022, mere months into the war, Russian artillery fire struck the village. Numerous structures that had been standing for decades were wiped out in the blink of an eye. The village's council building, for example, was taken out by Russian shelling, and the penitentiary was severely damaged only a few weeks later. It didn't take long for the village's population to plummet as locals fled for their lives. Soon, fewer than 100 people remained, mostly those who were too old or unwell to evacuate, or simply unwilling to leave their lifelong home behind. With Russian forces quickly capturing ground in the Zaporizhzhia region, Tokmachka was only a mile from the front lines, so it soon became a top target for the Kremlin's troops. They took control of other nearby settlements, and for a time, it appeared inevitable that Tokmachka's days were well and truly numbered. But by May 2023, the village was a shadow of its former self. Reports mention how Tokmachka's central square was pockmarked by Russian shells. Pieces of shrapnel littered the streets, and the school's facade had been quite literally blown away. The people who remained had to make do without any gas, water, or power for more than a year. Many of their homes had been blown to bits by Russian munitions, and they were forced to spend much of their time hiding out in their basements, which had all effectively been turned into shelters. Only 9 miles, or 15 kilometers away, Russians seized the town of Polehi and began forcefully evacuating civilians and sending children off to the Kremlin's so-called rehabilitation camps. It seemed that a similar fate awaited Tokmachka, and Russia's commanders likely saw the village as a highly strategic location to take, given the fact that it was only about a mile away from Kyiv and roughly 23 miles, 37 kilometers, from Zaporizhzhia itself. Taking control of this place would allow the Russians to establish a foothold from which they could push on towards bigger and more important objectives, piling pressure on the region's capital. But then in June of 2023, everything changed. Having withstood the initial invasion in the first year of fighting and having received an array of powerful new weapons from their Western allies, Ukraine's forces managed to orchestrate a huge counteroffensive effort aimed at pushing the Russians back and recapturing lost land. This counteroffensive was particularly prominent in the southern regions like Zaporizhzhia, where Ukraine was eager to force the front lines further away from the larger cities and delay the Kremlin's advances. It didn't start off particularly well. Indeed, the first attack, which was carried out by Ukraine's 47th Assault Brigade and 33rd Mechanized Brigade, was a veritable disaster. One of Ukraine's tank columns came under anti-tank missile fire while attempting to traverse a minefield just outside of Tokmachka, Reports revealed that up to 25 Ukrainian vehicles were either damaged or destroyed in the assault, including at least 5 of the country's German Leopard 2 tanks. This led to a wave of worry in the media and among military analysts, with many fearing that Ukraine's much-talked-about summer counteroffensive was about to fall flat before it even began. Fortunately, they were wrong. Ukraine regrouped, reorganized, and even managed to recover some of the damaged vehicles. Following a more careful and cautious strategy in the days and weeks that followed, they soon began to enjoy some success, with Brigadier General Alexei Hromov reporting that the country's forces had gained nearly 2 miles of ground near Tokmachka since the offensive began. They were never fully able to push the Russians back as much as they wanted, but they at least managed to stabilize the front and prevent the village from falling into the enemy's hands. From there, a long period of positional fighting began, during which both sides effectively poked and prodded at one another, but without making any major breakthroughs or gains. The Russians remained committed to capturing Tokmachka and did all they could to achieve that goal, using the likes of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, assault squads, and drones as the war progressed and evolved, but nothing was ever enough. Why was this? Well, military analysts point to 2 big reasons underpinning the Ukrainian defense of Tokmachka. The first is the fact that while they may seem quite small and simple on the outside, many villages just like this have actually become strongholds in the Russia-Ukraine war. Indeed, all along the front lines, there have been similar stories of certain villages, some of which are barely even dots on the map, made up of little more than a single road with a few dozen homes along either side of it, that have proven remarkably difficult for Russia to capture. In other words, Tokmachka isn't an outlier, it's part of a trend. Ukraine has found ways to make these places almost impenetrable. They've laid mines in the surrounding fields, for example, which effectively funnels the Russians along obvious, predictable routes into the villages. They've also made good use of drones, especially later on in the war, to help them track enemy troops and armor movements. They can effectively preempt Russian attacks and organize their defenses accordingly. In addition, despite large parts of it being destroyed, the village has been heavily fortified. Old homes and dachas have been turned into secure bunkers, for example, while choke points have been established in narrow lanes, making any attempt at assault dramatically more difficult for the invading force. The second big benefit that works in Tokmachka's favor is its geography. The village is almost entirely surrounded by elevated ground, and while war may have changed a great deal over the ages, one truth has always remained: whichever side holds the high ground holds the advantage. Because even as armies have developed incredible new weapons and defenses, they've never been able to rewrite the rules of physics. When you have an elevated position, you can see further all around, which makes it much easier to spot any enemies approaching and attack them before they get too close. This effectively means that it's impossible for the Kremlin's commanders to plan any sort of surprise attack on Tokmachka. Ukraine's defenders will always be 2 steps ahead of them, with artillery, drones, and other defenses locked on and ready to strike at the slightest sign of movement. And that's exactly how it played out for quite a long time, over the latter half of 2023, throughout 2024, and into 2025 as well. Then the situation changed once more, and the fate of the village hung in the balance. Before we look closer at that, there's more where this came from, so if you're getting value from the military show, don't forget to subscribe. Towards the latter half of 2025, after months of failed assaults and pathetic progress along many frontline locations, Russia's commanders decided it was time for a change. They organized a new, large-scale offensive in key areas, focusing particularly on southern Ukraine and even more acutely on the Zaporizhzhia region. The orders came down from above. Russia needed to make progress, and it needed to make it quickly. This was all part of a concerted effort by the country's military leadership and its president, Vladimir Putin, to paint the picture that Russia was winning the war and that its total victory was inevitable. This, in theory, would give the Kremlin a much stronger position at the negotiating table when dealing not just with Ukraine, but with the United States and even the European Union. The more land the country could claim, the more cards it would hold. So additional assault squads were assembled in order to advance. Russia's commanders hoped that the sheer weight of these attacks would eventually prove sufficient for them to break through Ukraine's defensive lines and capture those key settlements that had eluded them for so long, like Tokmachka itself. And so in October and November, the area came under increasingly heavy assault. One massive mechanized attack after another hit the village, which was valiantly defended by members of Ukraine's 118th Separate Mechanized Brigade, part of the 10th Army Corps. One of the brigade's press officers has described the village's guardians as the cyborgs of Tokmachka, referencing the iconic Ukrainian servicemen who heroically defended Donetsk airport from May 2014 to January 2015. Despite being almost entirely surrounded and forced to fight in extreme conditions, including sub-zero temperatures and continuous artillery bombardments, these brave soldiers survived, earning their cyborg nickname and cementing their place in Ukrainian military history. They may not be as well known as the original cyborgs, but the incredible personnel stationed in and around Tokmachka have shown the same extraordinary spirit and resilience in fending off repeated Russian attacks and maintaining control of the village. On October 20, 2025, for example, Russia organized one of its largest ever assaults. A huge force was assembled, including units from the Kremlin's 71st Motor Rifle Regiment, 2 additional motor rifle companies, and around 26 armored vehicles, including tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, Tiger vehicles, and armored personnel carriers (APCs). In theory, a force of that size and strength should be able to take out an entire town, let alone a tiny village, but that's not what happened. Instead, Russia's huge assault was a spectacular failure. Ukraine's defenders dug in and did what they do best, making the most of the weapons and defenses at their disposal to lay waste to the attackers. The day ended with 30 Russian troops dead, others wounded, and an estimated 21 vehicles completely destroyed. Despite all of this, perhaps out of embarrassment or simply as some sort of propaganda tactic, Russian officials seem to claim that their efforts have been successful. On November 16, 2026, the country's Ministry of Defense announced that Tokmachka had been completely captured, with the Defense Minister Andrei Belousov stating that the village was fully liberated and that Moscow's forces were well on their way to achieving their larger long-term goals. Ukraine, of course, refuted any suggestion that Tokmachka had been taken. And days later, Russian officials appeared to quietly backtrack on their initial statement, as they once again started reporting heavy fighting around the village, which doesn't exactly line up with the idea of it being fully liberated. As the weeks and months have passed, more assaults have reportedly taken place, but each one has been stopped in its tracks by Ukraine's defenders. Russian media figures have repeatedly claimed that the village is on the cusp of being captured, and the story of Tokmachka has even become something of a meme in military communities. Ukrainians online have stitched together clips of Russia's military expert talking about successes in the area, while humorously pointing out that the world's second army has still failed to take a village of just a couple of hundred people. Some Russian universities have even reached the point of threatening to expel students who mention Tokmachka in any sort of mocking way or dare point out their country's military failures. But make no mistake, this is a failure of truly historic proportions. In mid-May 2026, United 24 media pointed out that the Russian siege of this tiny village had officially lasted over 1,500 days. That makes it one of the longest sieges of a single location ever recorded. Longer than the siege of Carthage by the Romans, for example, which lasted around 1,100 days. Longer than the Great Siege of Gibraltar, which lasted an estimated 1,320 days. Longer than the sieges of Leningrad, Rome, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. History is littered with examples of supposedly great armies coming up against seemingly impenetrable fortresses and sending countless men to their deaths in a bid to conquer them. Most of those examples, however, revolve around huge cities with massive castle walls, great gates, and veritable armies of defenders. Many of them also took place literally centuries ago, before the modern era of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, fighter jets, drones, and howitzers, when armies had to make do with far simpler weapons like swords, spears, bows, and catapults. And this only serves to make Russia's attempts to take Tokmachka even more humiliating. This is not a great city. It's not a fortified capital. It's not home to tens of thousands of people, nor does it have its own army to defend it. It's an almost insignificant village, a burned-out, crater-strewn settlement where very few buildings are still standing. It should not be this hard to capture, especially not for an army like Russia's, which has built up such a fearsome reputation over the years. For decades before the war began, countries across the globe were terrified of the Russian army. They feared its seemingly endless stockpiles of tanks and fighting vehicles, its massive number of soldiers, and its almost unparalleled strength. They watched and saw as Kremlin officials boasted about groundbreaking capabilities of their latest and greatest missiles or showed off their newest tank in grand military parades. They thought that the unstoppable Russian war machine would steamroll almost any opponent in its path. But all of that mythos, all of that aura, all of that power the Kremlin was so desperate to project is now being undermined as we speak. Because stories like this prove that the Russian military is nowhere near as strong as the world once feared. It can't even capture a single village. It has spent over 4 years trying to do so, and it's lost an estimated 2,000 soldiers in the process, along with literally dozens of vehicles, potentially tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military hardware and personnel, all for nothing. The village is still in the hands of Ukraine's 118th Mechanized Brigade. They still dig in to this day, making smart and strategic use of drones, mines, and more to repeatedly outwit and outplay their opponents. Meanwhile, even hardline Russian propagandists have been forced to own up to their country's embarrassing inability to take control of the area, with one of them going as far as comparing Tokmachka to Troy or Verdun, referencing the sites of some of the most legendary battles in history. In truth, however, the only thing legendary about Tokmachka is how well Ukraine is defending it. Even if it does eventually fall, which appears unlikely based on recent history, this tiny village will forever be remembered in the history books as the place that shattered the myth of Russia's military superiority forever. And this is just one part of the Kremlin's collapse. You can learn more about the country's continued failures and how Ukraine is cleverly exploiting them in this video, which looks at how Ukraine orchestrated one of its biggest and best deep strikes on Russian infrastructure in response to a brutal missile assault on Kyiv. Alternatively, check out this video to find out how Ukraine has at last found an exceptionally effective counter to Russia's relentless glide bomb assaults. To make sure you don't miss out on more insightful analysis and breaking news reports from the Russia-Ukraine war, subscribe to The Military Show today. And thank you as always for watching.